The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. On today's show, I've got Deepak Anand and Nick Pateras. Deepak is CEO and Nick is Managing Director of Europe for Materia, who are a medical cannabis and CBD company. Welcome, guys. How you doing?
Good, thanks.
We are doing amazingly, Anuj. How are you?
Yeah, really good. Thank you. And really happy to get you both back on the show. It's been too long. You guys are very popular in this space, so I'm looking forward to getting lots of insights out of you.
We're happy to be here as always. Always good to have a conversation with friends.
Oh, we like that. We like that. Cool. So, I mean, everyone does know you, but for the benefit of the few people that don't, would you mind giving us a little bit of background on yourselves and a bit about what you were doing pre-cannabis and how and why you chose to get in?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me and good to be back again, Anuj. My background is in pharmaceuticals. So prior to cannabis, I actually spent quite a bit of my time in Europe and the UK, particularly around the parallel trade business and the distribution of pharmaceuticals between European countries. So I was doing a lot of work there. Slowly, obviously, graduated my way into cannabis as a result of that, actually, and working with the regulator in Canada, who then advised me that they were looking at legalizing medical cannabis at the time. And so, that was sort of my foray into cannabis. Ended up working for a company called Cannabis Compliance Inc. that was acquired by Deloitte, where I kind of headed up the cannabis file there for them on the international side. And then also worked for a company called Zenabis, which has now been acquired by Hexo, and founded Materia just over two and a half years ago now. So yeah, it's a great background.
Great. Cool. And just before we get on to it, what was the thought process of getting into cannabis? Did you encounter any stigma? Was it kind of a difficult choice, or was it a no-brainer for you?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's always stigma associated with cannabis. I think that anyone that, thinks otherwise is probably being naive, especially from the communities that you and I come from, Anuj. I think, the South Asian cultures in particular still have lots of stigma. My parents still don't understand what I do, and all they say to me is just don't get arrested. So that stigma, unfortunately, is going to take some time to dissipate, but, we need to do what we can do to dissipate that.
Absolutely. Cool. Thank you, Deepak. Nick, now your go.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm the Managing Director of Europe for Materia. I'm based out of London, and it's from here that I oversee our operations and teams across the UK, Malta, and Germany. So while I'm based in London now, I actually spent most of my career working in North America, specifically Toronto. And so I, similarly to Deepak, also come from a pharmaceutical background. So I spent most of my career actually working for Johnson & Johnson in various commercial strategy roles. And then I moved into cannabis about 4 or 5 years ago. I joined an early stage data and media company called Lift & Co. as an early stage employee. Spent about 3 years helping scale that business, including taking it public somewhere in the middle there. And then about 2 years ago, as the Materia project was being assembled, I thought it was just such an exciting opportunity to tackle the European market, which was at that point at a very interesting inflection point. So I've been part of the Materia team for about 2 years. And as part of that, I moved to London, and which is where I'm born, and oversee our teams from here.
Brilliant. And how did you find the transition from massive corporate to the early stage, kind of small, rough and ready outfit type thing?
Yeah, I think I may have once told you this before, but the kind of soundbite in my head was when I left J&J, it was the 8th biggest company in the world by market cap. And I left to become employee number 8 at Lyft. And so the step change was absolutely massive. You're going from this huge oil tanker where processes are everywhere. You basically can't turn a corner without there being some kind of process on how to turn that corner, and how fast and at what angle, etc., to a little speedboat that doesn't even really have the control panel built. And so there's no process whatsoever, and everyone's roles are overlapping still, and people are constantly being hired and brought on. So you're constantly having to re-engineer what everyone does because there's a new team member that takes on new parts of their responsibilities. It's constant flux. there's no sitting still in it. So the change was dramatic. After a certain period of time, I felt I adapted to it, but you kind of basically just get used to the chaos. And kind of once you see that you can kind of control the chaos and put a loose kind of harness around it, then you can kind of empower people and energize them because they don't feel like they're shackled in any way. So it's all about empowering people and energizing them to go, listen, we don't really have a specific framework or a parameter built. Go and build it yourself, or just go without parameters. Go explore a certain business opportunity or a business idea without feeling like you're handcuffed anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure great learnings for taking to Materia. It's a bit sink or swim, isn't it? As you make that leap. So it's good to hear that. Cool. So let's get on to Materia. Why don't you tell us a bit about what you guys do, but some of the latest news that you got?
So we have been, for those who are unaware, we've been working on building out our footprint across Europe for about 2 years now, over 2 years actually. And the cornerstone asset on which we've been working is actually a processing facility in Malta. So to be clear, it's not a cultivation facility. The way we've architected the Materia business is intended to be capital light. And specifically what we mean by that is we stay away from cultivation, which requires obviously a lot of capital to set up, but also we think operationally is extremely delicate and requires a very specific, experienced set of skills to get right. We didn't feel we had that in-house, and we didn't want to play that learning curve. So instead, what we did was we set up a processing facility in Malta, which allows us to tap into a global network of cultivators and suppliers, processing their product into GMP in Malta, and then, of course, selling it across the European market. The interesting piece about Malta specifically, and why that's been a conscious choice for us, is in addition to all the kind of sector agnostic benefits around, a corporate tax environment that's very friendly, a progressive government on pharmaceutical manufacturing generally, Malta actually permits for the import of non-GMP certified biomass. And what that does is it allows us to effectively play a form of regulatory arbitrage across the European Union, bringing in product, processing it into GMP, making sure it conforms to all those standards, and then exporting. So the big milestone that we recently announced actually was the fact that we earned our EU GMP certificate for flower processing in Malta just a couple of weeks ago. So that's the real exciting piece for us, because we've been working on this rather radical transformation of what was once an auto repair shop into now a high security narcotics processing facility. So it's been, as I say, transformation is almost an understatement, but that's kind of the last and most recent milestone that we're very happy to be yelling about to the world, because we're so proud.
Absolutely. Congratulations. That is a big kind of milestone. And we'll get on a bit to talk about EU GMP and what all that means in a minute. But Deepak, as a kind of commander-in-chief, how have you found COVID, and have you had to pivot in any way? And, we always like to ask entrepreneurs about that kind of journey.
Well, as someone that spent, 2018 and 2019, probably 280 days on the road, generally each year, it's been a drastic shift from being used to being on the plane and always traveling to not traveling at all. It's definitely been a dramatic shift, but life goes on, and I think this is where having a team and very capable teams at that on the ground is incredibly important. So when you look at our different assets in Europe, whether it be Germany, the UK, or Malta, we have an incredibly competent team of people that are able to execute on the vision very effectively, despite not having to travel or having the ability to travel. So I'd say that having a strong team is very, very important in that. But it's been a dramatic shift for me personally, I have to say, and one that I am enjoying, might I dare. So it's definitely been interesting, but nonetheless, we all do what we got to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And have you had to do any pivots? Maybe not necessarily just off the back of COVID, but from the first vision of Materia to where you are now, are there any kind of things that you kind of learned along the way? You're like, we need to go in this direction instead of that.
For sure. I mean, one example that comes to mind is just, how we ended up structuring the UK business as an example, more specifically around CBD. I mean, we found that the path that we were going to go down, pre-COVID was going to be one that was more focused on retail kind of footfall and more dependent on stores. Whereas what COVID's shown us is that, consumers that are purchasing CBD in the UK are kind of doing so online to a large extent. So, we had to pivot our strategy, and we ended up acquiring a company in the UK that's a CBD, B2C e-commerce marketplace called Handpicked. And that resulted, was a result, I would say, directly of the change in pivot and strategy with respect to our UK CBD strategy as an example.
That's really interesting. I might pick up on that actually, because I get slightly conflicting kind of viewpoints, and I guess it all depends on where you are in the ecosystem. But there's a lot of people who think that because CBD is so poorly understood, you kind of need that bricks and mortar retail experience to someone to sort of explain it a bit more. But it sounds like you guys have maybe come at it from a different angle. Well, how do you see that sort of conversation, let's say?
Yeah, so I think that it is true that the level of category understanding is quite low. So you need to ensure that whatever channel you're distributing your products through, there is an opportunity for education. Now, absent sector or category specific products, retail is the best way of educating people. But the difference is, if you're talking about CBD products that are only bought through big box retailers, so a Boots or a Holland & Barrett, very, very rarely will they have someone who's actually trained adequately on CBD and can speak to CBD properly, as opposed to maybe a couple high-level bullet points. So in that instance, unless you're going to open a CBD-specific retail store, which comes with a whole bunch of operational overhead and upfront capital, then what you're really looking at is online as the best place for people to self-learn, ensure that they have the right kind of educational experience prior to being in the position to make a purchase decision. So generally, I would agree, retail is the right place to educate. But in CBD specifically, where there's no CBD specific retail landscape, and the big box retailers who are retailing probably not going to do an adequate job of education, online, we felt, was the right way of actually holding a consumer's hand through the shopping journey.
And that's where Handpick came from, right? I mean, what we do is we take the guessing out of it. We're not a mass market, list everything type of, e-commerce store. It's a very curated sort of, list and portfolio of products that we actually carry on the Handpick website. And that's sort of by choice, and directly to speak to that, Anuj, just because, we want to take the guessing out for the consumer and only offer products that we know and can actually stand behind ourselves, because we see that the market is absolutely flooded with a whole bunch of products that, may or may not be what is in the best interest of consumers or what they might want.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And thank you for that explanation. Intuitively, that makes a lot of sense to me as well, because, everyone's been into Boots or the supermarkets, and there isn't that hand holding, and understandably so, because they've got, hundreds of thousands of products in there. So, a lot of that makes sense. And Deepak, I think you were talking about it just before we went on air, the I Am Billy campaign. Do you want to talk a bit about how you guys are getting involved in that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So very happy to be an advisor to the I Am Billy campaign. Of course, for those that might not be familiar, clearly Charlotte Caldwell and Billy Caldwell have sort of, been at the epicenter of legalization, I would argue, at medical cannabis in the UK in many ways. And, it really goes back to a call that I'll never forget getting from Charlotte several years ago. And just basically the message was help. What can you do? She didn't know me. Somebody gave her my number, and it was literally like, my kid has epilepsy. I don't know what to do. We need, he needs medicine. What can you do to help? And then, sort of from there started the journey where, we brought him to Canada. Aurora was very kind enough to be able to provide a whole bunch of support to Charlotte and Billy. And obviously, he then came back and the Home Secretary got involved. And, first his medicine was confiscated at the border and then was given back to him in hospital, and kind of really led the movement of legalization. So I'd say the I Am Billy campaign is kind of focused on the next stage of what other patients need. I mean, Billy's certainly been able to not only benefit, but also get access to medical cannabis in the UK, but it's not the case for other patients. And so, the I Am Billy campaign is kind of founded on, patients' needs coming first, having, affordable and free access to medical cannabis in particular, and then just championing healthcare and medical cannabis access generally. And that's sort of what the campaign's advocating for. So very proud, both personally as well as from a Materia perspective, to be able to support the I Am Billy campaign and Charlotte and Billy and the rest of the amazing team that's been created to be able to embark on this journey.
Yeah, no, it's a brilliant campaign. And just to clarify, is it wider than just children? Are you talking about, any patient that might need medical cannabis as a
That's
treatment?
correct. Any patients in the UK or even broadly in Europe that might need access to medical cannabis, the campaign advocates for free, healthcare and free medical cannabis for those patients.
Brilliant.
And I think just to jump on that, I think it's so necessary for us to kind of keep the pressure on the government in that sense as a sector, because at a high level, the public probably recognizes, okay, medical cannabis is legal now. Are there still access barriers? Possibly not, if you're simply a layman on the street. And there's this conflicting situation here where you did have a medical review by the chief medical officer back in 2018, which resulted in the law change. And yet the law that was actually implemented still had so many barriers for patients to overcome. So step one was an official recognition that cannabis has therapeutic potential. Step two was, let's ensure that we have a route by which patients can actually access that potential. And yet it's extremely difficult for patients to walk down the avenue. So we need to keep pushing the government to recognize that the law is inadequate in place of what was recognized through the review. And patients are still being pushed towards black market channels because they can't buy their cannabis they can't get prescribed the cannabis through the NHS at affordable prices.
Yeah, it's my first-hand experience is that I think the general public still don't know about the legality of medical cannabis. I mean, a lot of them, but even actually amongst the NHS, I was speaking to a doctor and they said that, I'm not going to make up a number here because, 80% of statistics are made up, but there's a high percentage of the NHS that they didn't even know that medical cannabis is technically legal. So there's a lot of work to be done still. So campaigns like this are brilliant, I think. Cool. Okay, so now on to the main topic of the show, which is the European medical supply chain, I guess. But I guess how the European medical cannabis industry works underneath the hood. And, as is usual, I like to kind of approach it in a bit of a 101 way. So maybe we sort of talk about at the beginning, what are the types of medicine that are available and what the routes are to get to a patient, if that's not too huge a topic to condense.
Yeah, for sure. So I think there are probably two broad buckets of products to consider in the medical cannabis universe. On one end of that universe, you have the pharmaceutical medical cannabis products. And those are those that have gone through clinical trials. They've made their way out of, phase 3, which is effectively when you can commercialize a compound. It has a product monograph attached to it. There's an indication. So a doctor is prescribing this product for, let's say, pediatric epilepsy. But you also have all the information around adverse effects, contraindications, vulnerable patient populations for whom the drug should not be prescribed. And so all of that information has been trialed and tested through the clinical trial process. So a drug like Epidiolex from GW Pharma would fall into that camp. Then you have what most people would probably consider when they think of medical cannabis, which is the unlicensed medicines routes. So that's, the flower, the extracts that made up a large part of the market today. And then those products are really prescribed, as the name suggests, off-label or unlicensed, not even off-label, that's not correct, unlicensed. And what that means is a physician is taking the judgment into him or herself and prescribing at their discretion, saying, you're talking to me about, say, your pain condition. We've tried other forms of treatment. I know anecdotally that this might work for you, or you are coming to me and saying that you've tried cannabis on your own and now you want to go through the medical channel. And so I will prescribe it for you. So it's prescribed as an unlicensed medicine without all of the clinical data behind it around the entirety of the risk profile, the dosage as well, etc. So those are kind of the two broad buckets of how cannabis works in the European market. So just to zoom in for a moment on that second bucket, which is, again, what most people think of when they think medical cannabis, those are really sold through the traditional supply chains of wholesalers selling into pharmacies across Europe and a pharmacist actually doing the dispensing to the patient. Now, because the product is unlicensed, there is also a compounding step required in most European countries. And that's where you hear this term magistral preparation, which means the pharmacist is doing a final preparatory step prior to dispensing the product to a patient. And that can be a range of different things. It can be grinding up the flower, putting it into effectively a tea. It can be repackaging it into the pharmacist's own package. Laws will differ based on the jurisdiction, but that's basically what we mean when we say magical preparation or an unlicensed medicine.
And what was the thought process behind that extra step?
Well, so effectively what you're doing is you're accomplishing two things. One, because the product is not being sold as a finished product in the sense that it's not a pharmaceutical product completely finished, there needs to be some kind of compounding done by the pharmacist to ascertain a certain quality standard. But also it's to ensure that the pharmacist actually speaks to the patient and is in control of the dose. For instance, often what a pharmacist will actually receive from a wholesaler is effectively what is a bulk cannabis product. So a unit size that has to be broken down into an actual prescribable dose for a patient to take home. So there are actually a number of benefits, but I would say kind of those are the main two.
And I just wanted to add as well, Anuj, I think we often categorize Europe very broadly and generically. I think a lot of the comments that Nick was making was specific to the German market in many ways, and sort of Germany, which obviously is the largest market in Europe. But, there's still a lot to be done on the harmonization side in Europe, right? I think it's very difficult to broadly characterize the European medical cannabis market because there's several nuances. I mean, Denmark has a whole different program when you compare to France or Germany. And of course, Germany is the largest market and we're sort of, set up and really hunker down as our base. But there's still a lot of work to be done across harmonization in Europe. There's still countries where medical cannabis is incredibly challenging to get, leave alone getting into the whole, regulatory structure. So in fact, as a business, that's actually what, really excites us and interests us in terms of where Europe is going to be going towards. There's many countries such as Spain, as example, that haven't even come online yet in any meaningful way with respect to their own medical cannabis programs. So quite a bit still needs to be done on the harmonization side. We know that the European Union and Brussels is kind of looking at harmonization. Obviously, that's going to be a long time away from a practical perspective. But nonetheless, much more needs to happen still in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess therein lies the challenge and the opportunity, as you sort of said. Okay, so that's really good to sort of break it down in those two broad buckets. And again, it will be specific to each jurisdiction within Europe, but at a general level, that's a really good description. So then maybe we talk about the standards that these are kind of sold under, if that's the right way, or kind of manufactured under, if that's another way of putting it. So the term EU GMP is bandied around a lot. It'd be great to understand a bit more what that is. And also, I am going to misquote something that I'm often misquoted in saying that flour can't be EU GMP, but I think you referred to it as being in certain scenarios. So maybe you could clear that bit up as well.
Yeah, so I mean, there's no such thing as GMP on any agricultural commodity, right? I think that's the biggest sort of, confusion that most people have on cannabis. So at a very high level where GMP kicks in is anything that's post-harvest. So there's no such thing as a, cultivation facility having GMP for the cultivation activities themselves. And certainly in Canada, what we've seen is fully vertically integrated operations by virtue of the regulations that have forced them to have seed-to-sale programs, which, now aren't necessarily the case in many, many other countries, and quite frankly, the foundation on which we're based. So there's no such thing as GMP for, cultivation of flower on its own. However, when you start to bring in any medicines, and I'll maybe work it backwards, when you're trying to put a medicine onto a pharmacy shelf effectively, and through the way that Nick described as example in Germany, that needs to be of GMP standard. And so you need to make sure that any activities that were conducted from the time that product was taken off the plant till the time that it went into patients' hands effectively, were all done according to good distribution or good manufacturing practices. And so that's where GDP and GMP become very important. And, that's sort of, the critical step in which, if you're going to be selling products in many European markets, you need to have GMP certification before you can actually put products in the market. But that just unpacks a little bit of the GMP compliance. We can obviously get into that a lot more because it's a massive subject on its own.
Yeah. I mean, without going into too much detail, because I know it can be, it's a very high standard, but what are some of the typical factors involved? Is it just a really kind of well-documented process of anyone that's been near this product?
It's several different things, and depending on the activities and what you're doing, and it touches many, many different things. At its core, anything post-harvest. So as soon as you take the plant off, whether it be drying, curing, trimming, packaging, labeling, stability, all of those things need to be done in a GMP compliant fashion. And so there's many, many layers as you get into each process and what that does. Your quality management system on its own and your SOPs need to make sure that they comply with GMP standards and you're operating to those standards. And so I think people often are very quick to say, their facilities are built to GMP design or, are going to be compliant with GMP. And those are often misleading terms in many ways because there's no such thing. It's very specific to every process. And, that's at a high level sort of where GMP comes in with respect to cannabis.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to drill down on this one more time, EU GMP is distinct from other types of GMP. And what is the delta there? And, how much more exacting are those standards?
So any pharmaceutical product that is put out anywhere in the world needs to operate to GMP standards. There's, at its base level, there's something called WHO GMP, which is the World Health Organization, and the standards that have been mutually agreed to by all members of the WHO with respect to their facilities and their operations and how they comply. So generically, when you say GMP, it's often WHO GMP. And then there's several iterations from there. EU GMP is the highest kind of standard and the gold standard. And I think people often think that EU GMP on its own is the gold standard. What I want to say is that, EU GMP is part of something called the Mutual Recognition Agreement process. And there's a whole bunch of countries that actually sign up to that. And, recently there's several countries sort of agreed that if Health Canada, in Canada's example, awards a facility with GMP standards, that will be recognized mutually by the European Union, as an example. And so it's sort of, mutually recognized between countries. Now, in cannabis specifically, there's many nuances why something cannot happen and why you might need a regulator from one country to go to another country to inspect them, because cannabis is very specific processes, and regulators in many cases like Canada might not award GMP. But there's, that's sort of at a very high level. It's EU GMP is the gold standard. And the reason why EU GMP has become important for Europe is because Europe was initially, and now is, still is, the largest block of countries that require EU GMP, which is their standard, to bring in product into Europe, right? The reason we haven't seen Health Canada GMP take precedence is because Health Canada never asked for its operators to have GMP before they could put products on the market. And so what you've now, the reason EU GMP has become important is because the EU is requiring any cannabis activities to have GMP. Now we've started to see Australia and Israel go down the path of asking for GMP as well. And had they taken the lead, perhaps Australian GMP or TGA GMP would have been the buzzword in the cannabis industry. But because the EU is allowed for this, EU GMP is sort of where most things are getting around.
And the reason also, I'll just add on, Deepak mentioned the mutual recognition agreements between, let's say, the European Union and other jurisdictions around the world, is you can't only look at the fact that an MRA agreement might actually be in place between Europe and other countries, but you also need to look at what is within the MRA. So, for example, two countries might have an MRA, but unless they both also have cannabis as acceptable or listed as an active pharmaceutical ingredient for herbal medicine production, then that MRA being in place doesn't actually mean anything. The MRA needs to actually contain cannabis listed as an accepted form of input material for herbal medicine. So it's all these different things that actually come together.
Yeah, brilliant. I love this, guys. Thank you. It's great to clear up a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, and from a business perspective, if I could just add really quickly, Anuj, on that, from a patient safety perspective and from a business perspective, it's becoming, countries are starting to recognize that they don't want to become a dumping ground of product that was mass produced in a variety of different places. They want to make sure that their products that they're putting on their market are actually going to benefit patients or are going to be of the highest quality. And so that's why people are starting to request GMP. I thought I would just kind of mention that.
Yeah. No, and it's good. It's tough, but it is, there for a reason, I think. Okay, that's brilliant. And that's kind of good, mapping out the sort of supply chain from that early side of it. Now let's talk about it getting into the hands of patients. It's clearly the physicians are somewhat the gatekeepers here. How do they know what to prescribe in general? And we know that a large part of that answer is there is a huge amount of education that is needed still, but how is that generally working?
So the physicians usually draw their information from, I think, three stakeholders around them. The most obvious one is the actual manufacturers, who go out with their sales teams. They visit physicians. They speak to them about their specific product attributes, what data they may have behind them. A lot of these products actually do have data behind them and trials that have been run. By and large, those are observational in nature as opposed to truly clinical in nature. But that's kind of the first way that a physician might start to shape their views around specific products. The next will actually be around the patients themselves. So what we see a lot, especially in a market like Germany, is the conversation around cannabis as a form of treatment is actually initiated by the patient who may have been self-medicating through products used on the black market. So they'll go and very often they'll actually be more knowledgeable about the medicine than the physician might be. And they'll be encouraging their physician to consider prescribing them cannabis as a form of medicine. And then the third one is actually the pharmacist. So the pharmacy landscape is very fragmented in Germany. As a pharmacist, you can only own 4 pharmacies in total. So there's not a lot of room for consolidation. And so I think there's a lot of localization in Germany between the specific pharmacy outlet and, a local physician that might be in the same town or area. So often there is a dialogue between the physician and the pharmacist where the physician might say, listen, I actually don't have this particular stock in product that you prescribed. The patient's here. Are you okay if you reissue the prescription, swap out for a different brand, for example? Or by the way, hey, we're getting a lot of patients asking about this particular product, and we've never filled a prescription for it. Have you heard about this product? Would you consider prescribing it for a patient? We're hearing it might be very effective for other patients where we're dispensing it for, let's say, multiple sclerosis, for instance. So the physician is influenced by the companies, the patients, and the pharmacists all around them. I would say they are probably on the band of all three, of all those stakeholders, probably the least educated, generally speaking, or at least the most conservative, generally speaking, because they're often taking on the viability of the patient's health. And we're talking about a product that is regulated as a narcotic. It's an herbal medicine, but it's also not really got the data behind it that a physician would normally be comfortable with. So they're kind of unsure about how easily or readily they should adopt this new medicine when the data might not necessarily be behind it. And you do see in the data that some German patients actually decide not to renew their prescriptions or step out of cannabis as a treatment as well, for sure.
Very interesting. And to dig into that, the middle limb of that, the patient-led kind of influence, is that feels a bit novel to cannabis, or is it? I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine in the UK that I've ever been in a kind of doctor situation where I've said to him or her, can you prescribe a certain thing to me?
Well, that's exactly it. So the reason that exists is because it's obviously a pretty established black market where patients are easily able to buy a cannabis product and self-medicate and self-dose and self-treat. And the issue there is they amass some body of knowledge and experience with that product. So they're going to the physician more knowledgeable. If you didn't have an unregulated channel that was so accessible, you wouldn't have patients feeling so strongly going to doctors saying, I know this works because I've been using it for the last 2 years. And now I want to have a legal product where I can be assured of the safety profile and potentially have it covered by my insurer rather than paying out of pocket as well. So there's probably very rarely that you would, with another type of product, that you would go to a doctor and say, I've already tried it, not have the doctor, be entirely surprised or shocked, and have the doctor go, okay, I'm open to at least having a conversation about this.
Wow. Yeah, really interesting and fascinating to see how that develops, I think. So as we sort of get towards the final stages of the chat, maybe we talk about where all this cannabis product is coming from, because the thing that you and I talked about before, Nick, is it's really becoming quite global, this supply chain. And where are these products coming from and how are you seeing that evolving? Where do you think that's going, kind of thing?
What's exciting to us is seeing the establishment and implementation of global supply chains. If you rewind 2 years in Europe, most of what's being sold into the region is coming from Canadian producers or from Bedrocan. So 2 years ago in Germany, those were the only 2 sources of supply. Fast forward to today, and we have products that have been produced in Australia, in Israel, in Denmark, in Portugal, in Uruguay. So you've got this litany of sources, and that's only good for the patients because you end up with an available set of products that can compete on quality, and it forces everyone to actually think about what's best for the patient as opposed to simply grow and they will come. attitude. And so I think we're going to see the longevity of that. And so for us, just going back to the Malta facility for a moment, that's kind of the reason we chose not to do cultivation. Mentioning my earlier point, we get to tap into all of those global supply chains and bring to market something that we know a patient will actually need and a physician will actually want.
And I might just add to that as well. What I'd say on Anuj is different about Materia, and I think what should be different about Europe in many ways is, remember, we're now 5 years plus into a medical program in Canada. There's a lot of learnings that can come through that, right? We now have the benefit of hindsight, which is what the Canadian players didn't have. So there's no reason why we need to make the same mistakes. There's no reason why we need to set up global cultivation facilities in Europe, in small countries, in highly expensive countries. And so what we've done is taken and adopted a lot of those learnings, whether it be to Nick's point, kind of, pulling from those global supply chains. But how do we make this so that it's more effective from a cost perspective so that patients ultimately benefit as a result of that? And so I think the European industry generally has a lot of hindsight and a lot of mistakes to learn and pull from. I know we at Materia certainly, constantly keep looking at that and say, all right, that company did that. That's where things are going, or this is where the market is moving towards. And I think it's very important that we don't lose sight of a lot of those learnings and not make those same mistakes again in Europe.
Absolutely. Yeah, look, it's you're both from Canada, so I'll choose my words carefully, but there have been a lot of mistakes to learn from there. So maybe we can drill down a bit now on product type. How are you seeing that evolve? So from an outsider's perspective, let's say, the idea of flower as a medicine is probably quite strange to a lot of people. How are you seeing that develop? And also with the legacy cannabis users who have been using it for a medical reason will be comfortable and understand that. But if you're talking about a new segment of patients who we want to open up this medicine to, we might have to think a bit differently. How are you seeing that all develop?
I would say we're seeing it develop as you might expect, in that extracts are still today a small portion of the overall market. I think if you look, the split between just extracts and flower, it's still 90-10. Favor to flower, in Germany anyway. But yet, at the same time, extracts is growing much faster than flower is. Of course, it's a smaller base, so you might expect that. But the adoption curve is generally there, and it's in place. You are still seeing the growth of the market at large across all segments, to be fair. So you also see the pretty fast growth of products like dronabinol as well, effectively THC isolate, which has been prescribed in Germany for a lot longer than the modern or last version of the medical law was put in place. So Germany's current medical law was put in place in 2017. Dronabinol's been prescribed in Germany since the late 90s. So it's a known entity. We see the growth across all of those segments. Extracts for sure faster. And I think that the key will often be around how fast we can bring new patients into the market, because to your point, legacy patients are comfortable with flower. They're not looking to switch. It might also be something that they find more cost favorable. But if you can get extracts to a place where they are able to be covered by insurers so that is an appealing proposition to them, or to patients who are paying out of pocket, again, at a price that is something they find affordable, then you'll see that adoption curve accelerate. That's kind of where we see the market today.
Yeah. And are you seeing much around drug delivery? So different ways of getting it into your system? Or again, is that still at its very, very infancy?
It's tougher with different forms of drug delivery because of the magisterial preparatory step that's required. So, ideas like sprays or capsules that have, either sustained onset or delayed onset, all of those products would need to fit through the compounding framework of the pharmacy. And that makes things a little trickier. So I think one day we will be able to crack that, where you give the tools to a pharmacist, they can assemble something in a magisterial preparation and still offer patients something that's, let's say, onset delivery is prolonged, by way of example, but no one's managed to do that yet. And as a regulatory regime, things are evolving in Germany. So I think even the regulators' understanding of how that product would be compliant is also evolving.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, again, where you compare and contrast Europe a little bit, because, what, again, Nick was alluding to in Germany is very specific to Germany, whereas in Denmark, you've seen, capsules available, for example. Now there is affordability and access and a whole bunch of other challenges that Denmark has faced. But generally, or the UK as an example, you have seen other product formulations start to make their way into the market. So I think this is where harmonization to a certain extent also needs to play into the conversation in Europe, because what we're seeing is, the largest market being Germany doesn't have a lot of these formats yet. And, that is going to change, because now we're starting to see other European countries have, different products that they do allow. So harmonization at some point also needs to come in, and it will change. And I mean, we're certainly thinking and planning for that, but we are dealing with the here and now from a Materia business perspective, which is predominantly in Europe, the German market, and it's based on that.
Yeah. And I guess data will underpin this, right? So if efficacy is improved by these other ways of doing it, all regulators will have to sit up and listen to it, I guess.
Everything, efficacy, bioavailability, something that's more easily titrated. All of these help our conversations with physicians and pharmacists, because they all fill out the language that they're used to using.
Absolutely. And just very quickly, are you on the extract side? Are we seeing isolates or sort of more full spectrum kind of extracts?
Well, technically, dronabinol itself is an isolate by design. I think you're seeing a lot of focus on full spectrum extracts on the medical side of things, not the CBD side of things. So more and more companies are launching full spectrum extracts into market, obviously with different potencies. We see a lot of success with balanced products at the moment. But I think the market is going to start really be a bit more discerning on extracts too, as we've seen in flower. So for example, flower right now, we see some of the leading pharmacists are actually asking for things like specific type of irradiation, because they feel that certain forms of irradiation actually toast the product and dispossess it of all its flavor and its terpenes. We've actually had pharmacists ask for hand-trimmed product, for example, as well. Like these are things that you wouldn't expect of a relatively nascent market, but the most sophisticated patients and pharmacists, who I'll caveat are not representative of the whole market, but they are the leading indicators of where the market will go. They're asking for that. So it's not just about high THC profiles. It's about certain terpene profile as well, hand trimming, etc. On the extract side, to get to your question, I think you're going to start seeing, more and more demand for single cultivar extracts, for example. And I think that's going to be something that the market hasn't really looked at yet, but we can see that being important moving forward.
Brilliant. Thank you. My last question was going to be, what are your predictions for the future? And so, Nick, you've given us a couple there. Deepak, do you want to round this off? And where do you see this kind of go? I'm not going to try for 5 years. That's crazy in this space. Maybe the next year or two.
Yeah, look, we definitely see more markets opening up, even within Europe themselves. There's a number of countries, as we mentioned at the top of the conversation, that are still not even open for medical cannabis. And so we certainly see those coming online. And then from a Materia perspective, on a global scale, right? I mean, we're based in Europe, but we certainly are able to service the globe from a GMP perspective, given that we've got EU GMP and given the whole mutual recognition process. If there's countries that haven't come online or are looking at GMP, whether it be Brazil, Australia, Israel, there's a lot more that needs to happen. I think one thing everyone can agree on is that the global cannabis market is only going to be larger than what it is today. And there's no debating that. There's going to be more opening up of markets. And so we're very excited about what the future holds, not only within Europe. We know that it's been slow, and I think it's very important to message that correctly, because it is going to be a slow build out and a slow rollout within Europe. But there's many countries that are looking at legalization. You talk about India now looking at some sort of legislation and policies and starting to really pay attention to cannabis, and that's a sizable market on its own. And so what I think we've done really well at Materia is set a base for the future. It allows us a springboard to be able to service multiple markets, because we've got the core dialed in with respect to our compliance and certification.
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant way to end it, actually. And really appreciate the time, guys. This has been really educational, and I've learned a huge amount. So thank you. And we could definitely do another one, I'm sure. So thanks for joining me. Congrats again on Malta. Look forward to having you back.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Anuj.
Pleasure.